$350,000. That's the number I kept coming back to. Not the ships, not the men, not the machine they built to cross a frozen continent. The number. In 1939, with Europe already at war and the American economy still exhaling from a decade of collapse, Congress appropriated $350,000 for a single Antarctic mission. Not a visit, not a survey, a permanent settlement. The United States Antarctic Service expedition was, by the language of its own mandate, the first act of American sovereignty on the ice. I accepted the official story for a long time. Everyone does. World War II intervened. The men were needed elsewhere. The mission was suspended, the bases mothballed, and the continent was simply set aside until peacetime allowed a return. It's a clean explanation. It fits the timeline well enough that most people never look past it. Then I started looking at the evacuation manifests. Not the mission records, not the congressional briefings, the manifests, the actual itemized lists of what 59 men carried off the ice when the recall order came in 1941. And what I found, or rather, what I couldn't find, is the thing I haven't been able to set aside since. The classified seismic charts are not on those lists. The biological core samples are not on those lists. The flight logs from the Southern Survey routes, the ones covering a specific 200-mile corridor identified in late 1940, are not on those lists. These were professionals, Navy men, scientists with careers built on the custody of data. You don't leave the data, not unless you left in a way that made retrieval impossible or in a way that made retrieval undesirable. I want to be precise here because the temptation with a story like this is to reach for the dramatic interpretation before the evidence earns it. I'm not reaching. I'm only observing that a government which spent years planning a permanent Antarctic presence, which commissioned a 75-foot mobile laboratory designed to operate for months without resupply, which framed this mission in presidential language as an act of national destiny. That government, when it finally recalled its men, left the lights on, the meals half-eaten, and the most sensitive records it produced sitting open on the desks where they were last used. The question I want to sit with, before we go any further, is a simple one. What does a professional evacuation look like, and what does the other kind look like? Because East Base is still standing, and it looks like the other kind. To understand why the evacuation is strange, you first have to understand what the expedition was built to be, not what it became, what it was designed to be from the start. In 1939, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8234. The language of that order is worth sitting with because it doesn't read like the authorization for a scientific survey. It reads like the establishment of a territory. The United States Antarctic Service was empowered to construct permanent stations, maintain continuous occupation, and assert American interests over any land its personnel discovered or mapped. Roosevelt was explicit in his private correspondence with the State Department that the goal was not data collection. It was a presence, unbroken, documented, legally defensible presence, the kind that, under international convention, forms the basis for a territorial claim. This matters because it changes the frame entirely. A survey mission can be suspended. A colonization mandate cannot be quietly abandoned without someone asking why. The expedition didn't arrive in Antarctica as explorers. They arrived as settlers. They built two permanent bases, Little America III on the Ross Ice Shelf and East Base on Stonington Island, structures designed not for months, but for years of continuous habitation. The supply manifests reflect this. They brought printing equipment, a darkroom, enough preserved food for extended wintering, and a library. Admiral Byrd's own pre-departure briefings described the mission timeline in terms of rotating crews. The first team would establish the infrastructure. A second team would arrive to continue the work. Permanent occupation was not the hope. It was the plan. Hold that word, permanent. Because in 1941, with both bases fully operational and the infrastructure exactly as intended, the government reversed that mandate completely. No rotating crew arrived, no resupply ship, just a recall order, and an instruction documented in the Navy's own records, to leave the stations as they stood. Not to pack them, to leave them. The official explanation for why the aerial survey program slowed in late 1940 is a reasonable one. Antarctic weather is brutal and unpredictable. Visibility windows are narrow. Aircraft of that era were not built for the conditions the continent routinely produces. A reduction in flight operations, the official record suggests, was simply prudent airmanship. I want to be careful here because that explanation is not wrong. It just isn't complete. The expedition's flight logs from the period between August and November 1940 document something more specific than weather. Across multiple sorties operating in the interior, pilots began recording consistent instrument failures within a bounded geographic area, a roughly 200-mile corridor in the region south and east of Little America III. Compasses behaved erratically. Magnetic deviation readings became unreliable. In at least 3 separate log entries, pilots noted that their instruments were, in their own language, contradicting each other, not malfunctioning in a way that suggested equipment failure, contradicting, as though they were each responding to different sources. Let me say that more slowly. Multiple aircraft, on separate flights, weeks apart, entering the same corridor and losing the ability to trust their own instruments. Not once, repeatedly. The official record classifies this as localized magnetic variance, a known phenomenon in polar regions. And that is a real phenomenon. I'm not dismissing it. But localized magnetic variance of the kind documented in these logs, consistent enough across multiple flights to ground the survey program entirely by November 1940, does not appear in the expedition's published scientific findings. The corridor is not named, it is not mapped, it is not analyzed. It simply stops appearing in the logs, and the aerial program stops with it. Remember that corridor, remember the coordinates. If you're finding this investigation worth your time, consider subscribing. This series goes places most channels won't touch. Now, back to the expedition, because the grounded planes are only the beginning of what stopped working in 1940. The bases by this point were fully operational. The men were healthy. The equipment outside that corridor was functioning. There was no reason, logistically or meteorologically, to begin winding down. And yet, within 8 months of those final flight log entries, the recall order arrived. What happened in between is where this investigation gets harder to explain. When the British Antarctic Survey team reached East Base on Stonington Island in 1948, they documented what they found with the methodical precision you would expect from scientists entering an abandoned structure. Their inventory is still accessible. I've spent time with it. What they found was not a mothballed station. It was a suspended one, canned goods on open shelves, personal clothing folded in bunks, scientific notebooks not locked away, not packed, not destroyed, lying open on workbenches as though the men had stepped outside for an hour and intended to return. One account notes a meal preparation that had never been cleared. Not the romantic image of plates still on a table, but something more specific and more unsettling, the evidence of an interrupted routine, the kind of interruption that doesn't allow for deliberate packing. I want to be careful here because I'm aware of how this sounds. Abandoned polar stations often look dramatic to later visitors. Cold preservation creates an illusion of recency. These are reasonable counterpoints, and I don't dismiss them. But survival gear was left behind, in Antarctica, by men who had wintered on the ice and understood, with professional intimacy, that survival gear is the last thing you abandon, not the first. Let me say that again. Trained polar personnel, preparing to board a ship and return to civilization, left behind the equipment their own safety doctrine required them to keep within reach. The official framing is that the departure was rapid, driven by wartime urgency. I don't dispute the urgency. I'm only asking what kind of urgency makes experienced men decide that their cold-weather survival kits are less important than making the ship. Hold that question, because it connects to something I wasn't expecting to find when I started looking at what happened to the expedition's records after the men came home. The wartime explanation for institutional silence is, on its surface, entirely reasonable. In 1942, the United States was mobilizing at a scale that consumed the administrative capacity of every federal agency simultaneously. Scientific publishing schedules collapsed, research programs were redirected, civilian archives were deprioritized. That the expedition's findings went unpublished in 1942 is by itself unremarkable. What is remarkable is the pattern of which findings went unpublished and which did not. The expedition produced results across several distinct research categories: meteorological data, topographical surveys, geological samples, magnetic readings, and biological findings from the ice cores. When I traced the post-war publication record of each category, I found something that took me a long time to accept as a pattern rather than a coincidence. The meteorological data was published. The topographical surveys were published partially. The geological surface samples were published. The magnetic readings from the dead zone corridor were not published. The biological findings from the ice cores were not published. And the seismic data, the charts found open on the desks at East Base, were reclassified entirely by 1948, transferred from civilian scientific archives to Department of Defense restricted files. 3 separate institutional custodians. The Navy held the expedition's operational records. The State Department held the territorial and diplomatic correspondence. The Smithsonian Institution had received the biological and geological samples for analysis. By 1942, all 3 had independently ceased all outward communication regarding the same narrow category of findings: the biological, the magnetic, and the seismic, not the weather data, not the maps. Specifically and exclusively, the data collected from, or adjacent to, the dead zone corridor. Let me say that more slowly: 3 agencies, no documented coordination between them on this specific question, all suppressing the same category of information at the same time. I'm not saying that's impossible to explain innocently. I'm saying I haven't found the innocent explanation. If these patterns are raising questions you haven't seen raised elsewhere, consider sharing this work. The deeper this scrutiny reaches, the harder it becomes to ignore. Now, back to the expedition's findings, because the silence around the biological data is where this investigation becomes something I genuinely wasn't prepared for. Because the question the suppression raises is not administrative, it's scientific. What exactly did the ice cores contain that required 3 separate institutions operating in wartime chaos to nonetheless find the coherence to go quiet about it together? Ice cores are, by their nature, a record of the past. That's the entire scientific premise of extracting them. You drill down through accumulated layers of compacted snow and ice, and what you recover is a chronological archive: atmosphere, particulate matter, biological material trapped and preserved in the order it was deposited, sometimes across hundreds of thousands of years. They are, as far as the scientific community has ever been concerned, a window into what was, not what is. What the expedition's biological team documented in their 1940 core samples, the findings that were received by the Smithsonian, logged, and then quietly removed from the accessible archive, appears to have complicated that assumption. I want to be precise about what I can and cannot say here, because this is where the evidentiary record becomes fragmentary in ways I have to be honest about. The core samples themselves are not publicly accessible. What remains are partial references in administrative correspondence, internal Smithsonian memos from 1941 and 1942 that discuss the samples in language that is, to put it carefully, not the language of routine fossil cataloging. One memo, authored by a senior researcher whose name appears nowhere else in the expedition's public record, describes the biological findings as presenting an interpretive problem with significant implications for the stability of current models. A second reference, in a Navy liaison document from the same period, uses the phrase anomalous biological continuity. I'm not saying the ice was alive. I want to be very clear about that. I'm saying the data was handled as though whatever was found in those cores represented something that existing scientific frameworks were not equipped to absorb without consequence. The samples weren't simply unpublished. They were transferred, reclassified, moved to a category of record that requires clearance to access even today. The question I keep returning to is a quiet one. What does a fossil do that causes a government agency to classify it? Because whatever the answer is, it connects directly to why the snow cruiser, the machine built to operate in exactly the region those cores were extracted from, has not been seen since 1958. Here is what I know. A government built a permanent settlement on the ice and then abandoned it without packing. Trained men left their survival gear behind. Aircraft stopped flying over a specific corridor, and the corridor was never named. 3 agencies went silent about the same category of data without any documented communication between them. Biological samples from the ice were reclassified to a security level that still requires clearance to access. And the machine at the center of all of it, 75 feet long, 27 tons, the most expensive piece of mobile technology the United States had ever deployed to the Antarctic, was last seen in 1958 and has not appeared in any official record since. That is not a theory, that is a list of documented facts, and what I cannot do and want to be honest about is tell you what they mean. I don't have that answer. I've spent a long time with this material and I don't have it. What I have is the shape of the silence, the outline of something that multiple institutions across multiple decades have chosen not to discuss. I'm not in a position to tell you what's inside that outline. I can only show you that it's there. What I can tell you is that once you've seen the pattern, the selective suppression, the abandoned data, the recall order that predates Pearl Harbor, the corridor that appears in the logs and nowhere else, it doesn't resolve into something comfortable. It just sits there, the way the snow cruiser sits somewhere under the ice, waiting for someone to explain why a machine that size simply stopped being part of the record. If this series is raising questions you find worth examining, leave your thoughts below. The threads that come in from these investigations shape where the next one goes, and that matters. The next video goes somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. What I found when I started pulling the satellite imaging record for that specific corridor, the coordinates the pilots stopped logging in November 1940, is something I've now verified across 4 independent sources. I think I'm ready now. See you there. The snow cruiser is still out there, and no one in any official capacity has ever explained why we stopped looking for it.